Hello and welcome to a revision session looking at whether the Gestapo was the most important way that the Nazis tried to maintain control 1933 to 39. So the Gestapo being the most important way the Nazis maintained control 1933 to 39. Another way of thinking about this is about Nazi consolidation of control or power and totalitarianism, whether they'd achieved that. For the purpose of this video, I'm going to argue that the Gestapo was not the most important way the Nazis maintained control, and actually the SS, the Schutzstaffel, was much more significant as a cause, as were legal reforms, than the Gestapo. So let's start by having a look at the Gestapo. They did play a role in maintaining control for the Nazis. We know that they were involved in around 77,000 arrests and executions in this period, 1933 to 39, and that was for resistance to the Nazi regime, although we don't know exactly what type of resistance because they didn't keep really very clear records. We know that they operated without reference to any other police authority or court of law, and they could send people straight to concentration camps without any right of appeal, and that did make them quite a scary organisation. They investigated things like treason and spying and sabotage. However, they weren't as large an organisation as some of the other organisations within the Third Reich, like the SS and the SD and things like that. The Gestapo, at their height, are believed to have only had around 32,000 people. Propaganda suggested it was much larger, that there's a block leader in every kind of section of housing and that you were always being listened to. But we also know that the Gestapo weren't necessarily hugely well organised. So we know that Goering starts off with control over the Gestapo, partly because he had run this secret police organisation in Prussia or Bavaria in 1933 before it was extended over the rest of the country. Rom kind of vies for power as well, and the two of them kind of fighting for power in 1933 into 1934. Obviously, Rom is then knocked out by the Night of the Long Knives. Heydrich actually ends up in control 1934 to 36, and then 1936 control passes to Himmler under the SS. And this constant changing of hands suggests that perhaps Hitler was unhappy with the leadership, or at least that the people within the Gestapo aren't working particularly well together. They're maybe working more with their own interests at heart. And we can see that, for example, the Gestapo didn't have a huge impact on all people within Germany and making them all sort of behave themselves and agree to what the Nazis are doing, because even as late as August 1934, just after Hindenburg's death, when Hitler holds a plebiscite or a vote on whether he should be accepted to have the title Führer or leader of Germany, that 10.1% of people actually vote no to that. They vote against it, which suggests that, so that's around 4.5 million people who are willing to outwardly say that they don't agree with the Nazis, and obviously they're not too worried, if you're looking at that number of people, that the Gestapo are going to manage to find out who they are or persecute them, despite the fact that we do know they arrested and executed a large number of people and sent many more to concentration camps. Arguably, a more important group who helped the Nazis to maintain control in the period 1933 to 39 is actually the SS. As we've already mentioned, Himmler ends up in 1936 taking over control of the Gestapo, and they're sort of a branch that the SS, as part of the police system, look after or oversee. And we can see that there's much larger numbers of people in the SS than there were in the Gestapo. So, for example, in 1933, there were already 50,000 members of the SS. And 1939, that grows to around 240,000. So they're taken very seriously as an organisation. And they're also arresting political opponents. And from 1934, they're also running concentration camps. We know that there were around 70 temporary concentration camps set up. And they are quite successful in maintaining Nazi control, because they terrify many of the political opponents who are put there, in particular the SPD and the KPD, many of whom are so worried about going back to those and having the same kind of terrible living standards and fear that they had in those camps, that they kind of partly self-censor themselves after going there. So the SS and their role in overcoming lots of opposition and making sure the Nazis maintain control are far more important than the Gestapo were. In particular because they ran and oversaw the Gestapo from 1936 onwards. The SD was a relatively small organisation in comparison to the SS, and they were run by amateurs, and Heydrich kind of ends up in charge of them for a while, and there's about 50,000 officers. They're separate to the Gestapo, but they kind of overlap in their role. So they're also monitoring public opinion. They're trying to find out who the 10% are that voted against the plebiscite and things like that. But there's lots of confusion over who has what role, because the SD and the Gestapo are both sort of doing similar things, and who's in charge, and it's not particularly well organised, that system. So the SS is perhaps more important than those. But the police system is very important in introducing that sense of fear and terror that meant that many parties started to stop opposing. Legal reforms are also more important than the role of the Gestapo. For example, the passing of the Decree for the Protection of People and State in February 1933, after the Reichstag fire, effectively gave Hitler emergency powers. Hindenburg agrees to him using Article 48, and the emergency powers like being able to arrest and detain people without charge, and to enter and search private premises, and to censor publications and newspapers and things like that. And all those powers are a legal reform that's been made, and it gives him huge power. Similarly, the Enabling Act, which the long title for is the Law for Removing the Distress of the People and the Reich, also gives Hitler more powers that enable him to maintain control in this period from very early on. Hitler is able, through the Enabling Act, to pass laws without the approval of the Reichstag, and without reference to the president for a period of 4 years, which is significant because it enables him to pass a huge number of laws without having to get political approval or public approval. And that's all happened by March 1933. And we see a huge number of laws passed in 1933 that enabled the Nazis to maintain control throughout this period. So, for example, the KPD, the communists, are banned in February 1933 after the Reichstag fire, and the Decree for the Protection of People and State. June 1933, the SPD were banned for being hostile to the nation and state because they opposed the Enabling Act when it was passed. Obviously, they didn't want to be ignored when new laws were being passed. April 1933, a law was created for the Reich governors, creating Reich governors to oversee the running of each state. So they're kind of like Nazi governors, if you like, for each state and each area. Nazi special courts are being set up. We've got July 1933, the law against the formation of new parties basically made non-Nazi parties illegal. We've got there's the kind of support that these new things gave to harsh punishment. So, for example, the death penalty was increasingly being used 1933 to 39. We know that roughly 50 to 150 people were being killed each year, and that's kind of incremental, so it goes up from 50 in 1933 to close to 150 for most of the last years leading up to 1939 there. We know that there is the National Socialist Lawyers Association set up, which is another legal reform aimed at getting any opponents of the Nazis out of legal positions, so Jews in particular, but also those in perhaps other parties who might dislike Nazi socialist policies. The establishment of a People's Court was also created. That's another legal reform. It's got Nazi judges specialised in crimes against the Nazis, and obviously they're going to find in the favour of the Nazis. The Nazi specialist courts took no action against things like the Night of Long Knives, when Hitler openly supports the murder of many people and kind of illegal actions like rioting in the streets and things like that. So all of these reforms are enabling the Nazis to maintain control, because they now have complete control of the justice system. Nothing's happening when the Nazis break the law. They're effectively legally immune. There's really harsh penalties against anyone who is talking out against them, and they're kind of censoring talking out against them. The KPD, the SPD, they can't. There's no new parties being able to be set up, and they're able to censor what people are saying through the Enabling Act as well, and through the Decree for the Protection of People and State. They have all these new powers. So legal reforms are much more important than the Gestapo was. However, legal reforms are perhaps not quite as important as the SS, because without a huge number of people to cause fear and terror and to carry things out and to be in an organised fashion, it's unlikely that those legal reforms would have had the same effect. Propaganda did play a role, and arguably it could be said to be slightly more important than perhaps the role of the Gestapo themselves, as propaganda tried to portray the Gestapo as being larger than they were. So we've got things like book burning. In May 1933, around 20,000 books are being burnt by the Nazis, and we know that happens in Berlin, and that also then in 19 other university towns they kind of continue that on, and that helps the Nazis to maintain control, because they're burning the books of their enemies, the communists, the socialists, the Jews, and that sends quite a strong message to the people. Parades and spectacles were being used as well to try and to make it look like the Nazis were organised and that they had mass support, and that would make people less likely to oppose them. So use of uniforms and medals and banners and songs suggested really good discipline. Annual rallies being held at Nuremberg with always around about 100,000 or more people attending suggested mass support. Nighttime torch processions sent quite a powerful message. Ritual parades and flag waving as a sign of widespread support put off opposition. However, we do know that bloc leaders monitored whether people were putting up their flags in their windows and things. So you've got SS and SD looking out for those kinds of things. And if you didn't put up flags in your windows when there's a parade going past or that kind of thing, then you could actually be fired from your job. So parades and spectacles didn't necessarily prove that people supported the Nazis, but it certainly showed that they were able to maintain control on a mass scale. Film also was used to try and spread Nazi propaganda and get people to accept the messages that they had. In particular, Goebbels was quite clever with his use of films. So he didn't overly produce outwardly political films. Only about 140 out of the 1,000 films that he created, about 14%, were actually overtly political. Most of them actually were more about sort of other comedies or romances and things where they glorify leadership and war and things like that. And there's no pacifism. There's nothing against violence at all in any of the films. So it's all about glorifying leadership and the things that the Nazis stood for, without necessarily being just about the Nazis. However, having said that, there were some films that were very much outwardly pro-Nazi and politics. So we've got Leni Riefenstahl created two very famous films. One in 1934 called The Triumph of Will, which kind of celebrated everything about parades and spectacles and the things that the Nazis had achieved in their first year. And 1936 also, she made a very famous film about the Berlin Olympics, celebrating everything about Germanness and the kind of Volksgemeinschaft and what they had achieved there as well. And USA films were banned, except for Disney, because that was so popular, interestingly. Radio was another method that they used to try and kind of get people on board with propaganda. Hitler gave around about 50 broadcasts or speeches via radio. We know that these were broadcast in town squares and factories, and there'd be sirens going off beforehand, and everyone had to stop work to hear them. But then that also suggests that people are kind of being forced to hear what's going on there. It doesn't necessarily show support, but it does show that, or kind of demonstrates that the Nazis were in control, rather than necessarily showing how they got the control. Goebbels promoted mass production of radios, so 70% of households were able to own one because they were produced at quite cheap prices. And we know that April 1934, all radio broadcasts were being controlled by the NSDAP. And we know that they got rid of and fired around about 13% of staff on radio stations who they didn't feel would be pro-NSDAP. There's weekly posters being broadcast in, or sort of not broadcast, but stuck up in offices and public places and buildings, each week with a new Nazi quote displaying a sort of message that Hitler wanted them to accept. And newspapers were being controlled as well. So in 1933, when just before Hitler took over as Chancellor, there were around 4,700 different private newspapers. 27 of those were very quickly bought up by the Nazis, and they were circulating around 4.5 million different newspapers a week. And ultimately, they end up controlling all of the newspapers. So by 1934, they're all amalgamated and controlled by the state. And the SPD and KPD and other kind of Jewish newspapers were also banned as well. So propaganda does play a role in ensuring that people understood the message of what Hitler wanted, but I wouldn't say that that's the main way that they're maintaining control. I think the use of the SS and the SD and perhaps fear of the Gestapo were more important as were legal reforms, because those are the things that are forcing people to accept these messages and not to speak out against them quite so openly. It's also worth considering that part of propaganda was the Hitler myth. Hitler's role in trying to maintain control is very, very limited, 1933 to 1939. He used to like to make lots of long speeches and long rambling speeches and let other leaders turn his words into policies. So he's not necessarily creating the policies himself, although he was appointing people. So he appointed various different people, for example, in charge of the Gestapo. But he didn't like to read things, certainly not policies in great detail. He spent a lot of his time walking around and eating in his mountain retreat, not getting up until midday, watching films late into the night. And he's not directly in control of policies, so he's not really the most important way that the Nazis are maintaining control. However, having said that, Goebbels was very clever with his propaganda, and he creates this Hitler myth where Hitler is displayed as a political genius and a guardian of morality, and although initially in 1933 most people are unconvinced by this, by 1934 lots of political reports suggest that people were quite convinced that Hitler was this political genius. And that might be because of the scale of propaganda. There's constantly things that they're being told and that they're seeing in news broadcasts and newspapers and the radio and on posters and things, that perhaps they are starting to accept it. Or perhaps that people are starting to become so worried about the police forces that they're not willing to speak out against the Nazis. Hindenburg's death in 1934 was certainly not the most significant way that the Nazis managed to consolidate their power and maintain control, but it did help. Before Hindenburg's death, Hitler wasn't fully in control. He could have been dismissed, and there was a moment in June 1934 where it seemed very possible that Hitler was going to be dismissed because the SA, the brown shirts, they were causing a threat to the army because Rom had been saying that he wanted to take over the control of the army, and obviously Hindenburg, he's ex-army, many of the elites that he'd been working with as president were also army members, and they weren't very pleased by this. So there was a speech made by Papen in 1934 to a university where he outwardly says, Hitler's not in control, we should do something about this. So that pressures Hitler into taking action, like the Night of the Long Knives. We know that 88 people are killed, another 1,000 are arrested, and it forces Hitler into taking action. Although, having said that, Obviously, that also helped Hitler to maintain control himself because he was getting rid of political enemies there. So there had been a few divisions within his own party. Otto and Gregor Strasser, for example, were a group within the Nazi Party, or led a group within the Nazi Party, who were pro more socialist, almost communist policies that Hitler didn't necessarily agree with. However, obviously, the Night of the Long Knives, the fact that he has to do it in June 1934, suggests that Hindenburg ultimately still holds quite some power, that he forces Hitler into action there. After Hindenburg died of lung cancer in August 1934, and partly because of the Long Knives and the fact that Hitler had now got the support of the army back again, within an hour of Hindenburg's death, Hitler combined the roles of president and chancellor and declares himself Führer, although, as we've already mentioned, that just declaring himself Führer didn't necessarily constitute really having control of power, because only 89 or 90% of people actually supported that move themselves. However, Hindenburg's death did make it slightly easier for Hitler to make legal reforms and things like that, because he doesn't have to maintain a relationship with Hindenburg anymore. He can be a bit more free to make the changes he wants to himself. Finally, self-censorship, I don't think is a very important cause at all of the Nazis being able to maintain control. Certainly not in comparison to things like legal reforms and the SS and propaganda. And that is largely because self-censorship only happens as a result of fear and terror of the Schutzstaffel and of the legal reforms that have happened that meant that people had kind of lost their legal representation and rights. So, for example, we do know that the confessional church, the kind of breakaway from the Reich Church, or the Protestant church as you might call it, there were around 700 people arrested. However, although 700 people were arrested from there, the opposition isn't total to Nazis, so largely their opposition focuses on the Aryan paragraph being introduced into the church literature, and that's saying things like that Jews can't have a place in the church and that they should fire anyone who perhaps was a Jew at any point, even if they've converted. And their opposition is really based around Christian policy. They didn't openly oppose Nazi policies or Hitler himself. It was more about opposing the way that they were controlling the churches. So in that way, I suppose you could argue the confessional church were partly self-censoring. They're only opposing things that directly impact them, and not wider things, because they're worried about what impact that might have. Similarly, the Concorde Act, we know that the Catholic Church initially in 1933, obviously the Pope signs the Concorde Act, and they say they're not openly going to speak out against the Nazis so long as they're kind of left alone. And even after that's repealed, and the Pope issued an anti-Nazi pamphlet in 1937, after the sort of church schools and things started to be closed down and church youth groups, this opposition was also quite limited. So there were some early arrests of Catholic priests when they, in March 1937, are kind of speaking out quite widely about it in Germany, but the opposition only happens at one time, and that's probably because of fear and terror of groups like the SS and the concentration camps and the lack of legal powers that they have within the new state. And similarly, we know that after 1936, concentration camps were so brutal that people didn't, or in particular political groups, didn't want to continue to speak out against political matters. So that kind of suggests as well, it's not really self-censorship in itself, it's more fear and terror that are causing people to not speak out. We know that in a way self-censorship is actually quite limited as well, because although the KPD and the SPD weren't as large an organisational threat to the Nazis, and that suggests the Nazis were in control, still 5,000 KPD and SPD members were in concentration camps in 1933. The 10.1% who voted against the plebiscite in 1934 We know that there are underground cells of the KPD. We know that the International Socialist Movement also continued. And although both of those had limited success, they weren't self-censoring. It's just that they were unable to fulfill their potential, perhaps, against the Nazis and opposing them because of legal reforms that have made that impossible, and because they were being arrested and sent to concentration camps when they were speaking out against it publicly. So overall, the Gestapo, were they the most important way the Nazis maintained control? No. I think the SS were probably the most important way the Nazis were able to maintain control. And when they took control of the Gestapo in 1936, it did become a slightly more organised organisation. And I think legal reforms were also really more important. The Gestapo did play a role, but things like Hindenburg's death and propaganda, the Hitler myth, those sorts of things were actually probably more important. But the least important would be self-censorship, and the Gestapo was more important than that because it was one of the triggers of self-censorship, the idea that there was this secret police force everywhere. So I hope this revision session has been helpful. I would suggest perhaps writing down a similar essay question, perhaps thinking about to what extent Hitler had achieved a totalitarian state by 1939, or even try again with this one without looking at the information and just practice planning in just a minute or two the key information ready for your exam. Best of luck with your revision.